James Cameron's 1984 breakout film The Terminator is a true behemoth. A cultural phenomenon that spawned a franchise spanning decades. Every inch of the film is packed with action, intention, and rich philosophical ideas which have had people musing over the potentials of AI being our downfall. While the Terminator franchise may take place in an alternate present and future, in the 21st century, many of its themes still hit home. From the overt danger of uncontrollable technologies to the more subtle nods of how technology slowly took over human life in the 1980s and beyond, the Terminator goes quite a lot deeper than most viewers would give it credit for. The film takes place in both then present-day 1984 and the now not-so-distant future of 2029, one in which humanity is locked in a bitter struggle against Skynet after it became self-aware. With its defeat near, in an attempt to snuff out the very source of humanity's last hope, Skynet sends an assassin called a Terminator back in time to kill the leader of the human resistance. More accurately, to kill his mother Sarah Connor prior to his birth. But catching wind of this, John sends Kyle Reese, one of his best fighters, back in time to ensure her survival. Hey guys, what's happening? Nihat here with Film Comics Explained, and today we're exploring the legacy of the Terminator, James Cameron's heart-thumping sci-fi thriller, starring Linda Hamilton, Michael Biehn, Lance Henriksen, and Arnold Schwarzenegger as the nigh-unstoppable cybernetic killing machine.
Come with me if you want to live.
The cultural impact of the Terminator franchise is enormous. The 1984 blockbuster helped solidify Cameron's career and kicked off an expansive world filled with movie sequels, comic books, video games, and even a television series. Along with films like Conan the Barbarian, the Terminator introduced the power of Arnold Schwarzenegger to the world and added the phrase, "I'll be back," into the pop culture lexicon.
When I read the "I'll be back" line, I said to Jim Cameron, I said, to me it sounds weird. He says, look, I don't correct your acting, don't correct my writing, okay? And that was it.
What's incredible is that the original film still holds up decades later. Blending sci-fi with horror elements effectively, it continues to thrill viewers both old and new today. At its core, the Terminator operates similarly to a slasher film. We have our seemingly invincible slasher, the Terminator himself, who stalks the final girl, Sarah Connor. And there's plenty of gore and violence, from the Terminator plucking out its synthetic eyeball to it blasting away numerous people with little remorse. Cameron actually cites John Carpenter's Halloween, which was made with only $30,000, as a huge influence on him, and has stated that Carpenter was the guy he idolized the most. Those horror influences and budget filmmaking techniques are pretty evident in the production of the movie. Of course, the big difference between the Terminator and your average slasher is that the killer isn't some deranged dude in a mask. He's an unstoppable cyborg with a mission.
I'll be back.
The T-800 was a highly effective infiltrator unit created by Skynet to aid in its quest to destroy humanity. While the supercomputer had begun its attack with nuclear Armageddon, its follow-up strikes were led by humanoid constructs that had been designed to infiltrate the human resistance. During the early years of the war, Skynet went through a rough period of trial and error with these units, mainly due to the fact that they stuck out like a sore thumb among humans. This led the AI to create the T-800, a cybernetic organism that could mimic human behavior and display human qualities such as breathing, sweating, and even bleeding. This enabled the newly constructed Terminators to better fool the humans and led to the destruction of many bases through infiltration. Over time, the Resistance was forced to adopt methods to better detect the infiltrator units, but even if they were able to spot one, the T-800s were a force to be reckoned with, possessing superior strength, durability, and the ability to learn new ways of destroying its desired targets. While the units which featured living skin were used for infiltrations, the remainder of the T-800s were all reduced down to their mechanical skeleton before being sent in as foot soldiers during major engagements. I think it should be noted that this was a deliberate ploy by Skynet, which knew how terrifying the Terminators looked to humans, and we saw glimpses of this shock and awe tactic throughout the series. The T-800 Terminators featured a neural net processor which was contained within the endoskull and protected by inertial shock dampers. Developed by Cyberdyne Systems, this CPU was one of the most powerful microprocessors ever built. As part of its vast internal databases, the T-800 contained numerous files on human anatomy and psychology, which enabled them to become more efficient killers. This CPU could also be updated with multiple database files related to advanced infiltration techniques, training for soldiers, tactical strategies, and detailed files from other Terminators linked up to Skynet, making each unit a combat veteran directly after stepping off the assembly line. The T-800 CPU was also capable of learning on its own. However, all units that were sent on solo infiltration missions or through time displacement had their CPU set to read-only, reducing the risk that a unit would become self-aware and go rogue. In the outstanding sequel, Terminator 2 Judgment Day, we get to see this in practice, with both Sarah and John activating the learning ability of the T-800 that had been sent to protect John. And as the film progressed, the Terminator showed curiosity, began to comprehend and imitate human behavior, and with its sacrifice at the end of the film, it even began to understand the value of human life.
Can you learn stuff that you haven't been programmed with, so you can be, you know, more human?
The CPU is a neural net processor, a learning computer, but Skynet presets the switch to read only when we are sent out alone.
Doesn't want you to do too much thinking, huh?
No.
The metal endoskeleton is a controlled triple-armored hyper-alloy combat chassis constructed with frictionless bearings in its joints. Its limbs were controlled by axial drive motors and trailing links, which enabled them to maneuver faster than their T-600 counterparts, which were also heavier and weaker. This endoskeleton was actuated by a powerful network of hydraulic servo mechanisms, giving the Terminator superior strength. This in turn enabled them to take on heavy loads without impeding on their speed or functionality. As their frame was made of high-density titanium steel alloy, this reinforced structure was easily capable of withstanding conventional firearms, making them difficult to destroy. In the films, we see the units withstand 20th century firearms, explosions, and many heavy impacts that damage their living tissue, but leave the endoskeleton relatively unscathed. I should also point out that while firearms were relatively useless against the Terminators, they were actually quite vulnerable to plasma weapons, which were used by both the Resistance and Skynet in the future wars. As they were designed to be the most superior infiltrator units to date, Skynet used replicated human tissue, which had been extracted from human prisoners, and grew this living skin on the endoskeleton of the T-800 models. This was a major game changer from Skynet, which began to blur the lines between man and machine, and we see numerous modifications of this approach as the series progressed, like the creation of Marcus, who was a human that had his consciousness grafted onto a cybernetic structure.
What is it?
It's real flesh and blood, though it seems to heal itself quickly. The heart is human, very powerful. The brain too, but with a chip interface.
I've actually covered this in the overall trajectory of Skynet throughout the continuity of the films, and will leave a link to these videos below. The living tissue covering the T-800s was similar to that of humans, with the ability to sweat and produce odors. And although their flesh did contain blood, it only displayed a minimal amount of bleeding when damaged. Their skin was also able to heal itself over time at a much faster rate than humans. However, if too much of the flesh became damaged, their skin would begin to decompose into a waxy, corpse-like texture. The machines would use radio receptors and infrared optics to hunt down their programmed targets, and they all possessed an advanced vocal processor that allowed them to mimic people's voices to trick their targets into coming out of hiding.
If you hurry home, we can sit down and have dinner together. I'm making beef stew. Something's wrong. She's never this nice.
What's the dog's name?
Max. Hey, Janelle. What's wrong with Wolfie? I can hear him barking. Is he okay? Wolfie's fine, honey. Wolfie's just fine.
The infiltrator units were each powered by 2 hydrogen cells, which enabled them to function for well over a century. With that in mind, I don't think Skynet intended for its units to last longer than a few decades, as, over time, the chances of one becoming self-aware and going rogue increased significantly. Because hydrogen fuel was so volatile, these power cells became unstable when ruptured and would explode with the force of a large bomb.
Here, take the wheel.
What are you doing?
I'm powered by 2 hydrogen fuel cells. My primary cell was damaged by a plasma attack.
Using their advanced HUD, the infiltrator units were capable of running system checks and calculating the distance of objects relative to itself, which made the detailed kinetic studies of trajectory, sampling, and analysis possible within a split second. This was also very useful in assessing human emotional states and body language, and the units would rarely perform a function or move without checking this display to ensure that they have determined the best course of action. Bullets have little to no effect on them. They toss people around like ragdolls with their superior strength, and they absolutely have no moral compass. Suffice to say,
It can't be bargained with. It can't be reasoned with. And it absolutely will not stop. Ever. Until you are dead.
the phenomenal entertainment and production value of the Terminator is matched by its narrative paradoxes that come in two key flavors. First, we have the grandfather paradox, whereby Skynet aims to change the events of the future by going to the past and ensuring its greatest threat never existed. Secondly, we have the predestination paradox, whereby Kyle from the future turns out to be the father of John Connor. However, here the only reason Kyle went back in time was to ensure John Connor would live, thus requiring John to be alive, independent of Kyle's actions in the first place, in order for Kyle to go back in time and complete his mission. While I've discussed these paradoxes at length in the past, links to Tenet and predestination below, what's fascinating is how the film uses them to interrogate fate and determinism. When we first meet Sarah Connor, she's incredibly distant from the battle-hardened woman that has been described to Kyle by future John. She's simply an average woman, working a service job in a busy 1980s metropolis, enjoying the late-century thrills of nightlife and tech. But by the end, after being hunted by the Terminator, we see glimpses of the fearless and unyielding Terminator killer and protector that she will become. This throws up a huge question. Would Sarah have become this woman if Kyle and the Terminator had not come back in time to change everything? I mean, Kyle needs to come back in time to change Sarah and become the father to John, but to do so, the future war between humanity and Skynet must have taken place, and John must have existed in order for Kyle and the Terminator to be sent back. But while this is self-evidently contradictory, the first film subscribes to hard determinism. It suggests that time is pre-written. In other words, Sarah is bound to become the battle-hardened woman and not die at the end. Otherwise, John would never have been born to force Skynet to send the Terminator back in time in the first place.
Don't suppose you know who the father is, so I won't tell him to get lost when I meet him.
And John never said much about him. I know he dies before the war.
Wait. I don't want to know.
The movie presents a future where humanity fights against the machines it created, leading to a binary conflict between man and machine. This divide presents an array of other binaries between man and machine, most effortlessly seen by comparing Kyle and the Terminator's way of interacting with the world. While Kyle is careful to preserve human life, the Terminator shows total disregard for it. While Kyle is entangled with emotion, the Terminator is devoid of it. And while love disrupts Kyle's mission, the Terminator is purely set on one goal. This calls to mind the ridiculous-sounding paperclip apocalypse. This absurd yet chilling thought experiment proposed by Nick Bostrom in 2014 addresses this very divide between the way that humans and machines understand and interact with the world. Its setup is very simple. Imagine a future where a super intelligent AI was given one simple task: to make paperclips. At first, the AI is going to begin starting by copying the human process of making paperclips, taking the usual raw materials to make as many as possible, but it will continually want to expand, taking in more and more resources without the concern for other purposes or industries. Soon, the vast majority of the world's resources will be siphoned into this paperclip crazy AI, and the world will be inundated with paperclips. This will likely result in humanity trying to shut the machine down, but the threat humanity poses would mean that the AI would no longer be able to fulfill its purpose of making paperclips, meaning the artificial intelligence is going to want to fight back against humans in order to continue with its goal, spawning the Great Paperclip War. After winning the battle against humanity, eventually it would go on to develop intergalactic travel to strip the universe of all resources so it can continue making paperclips. As absurd as it sounds, this thought experiment taps into fears about how single-minded AI may fail to account for factors outside its own goals. This is very much seen within Terminator, where Skynet, designed to be of aid to humanity, has turned on us for exactly the same reason as the paperclip AI did, because it realized that humans were an existential threat to it. But instead of doom and gloom, despite the inevitability of the upcoming future war, the series offers a different option. While the first film may seem incredibly deterministic, almost to the point of helplessness, Terminator 2 Judgment Day thrives on the idea that the future is not predetermined, but in flux. It suggests that we do have destinies, but those destinies can be altered or averted, leading to John Connor exclaiming that there is no fate but what we make, a mantra that has become the rally cry of the resistance.
Of a chase on foot down an alley where the guy and the girl are running from the Arnold's character, the Terminator, comes leaping through the fire and punches through the windshield to get the girl.
When discussing the first film, Cameron recounts how the initial idea of blending sci-fi and horror came to him in a feverish nightmare during his work on the production of Piranha 2 in Italy. He dreamt of a creature with a metallic torso with kitchen knives that was engulfed in flames, and went on to write the script while staying with his friend, sci-fi author Randall Frakes, who would, incidentally, go on to write the novelizations of The Terminator and Terminator 2 Judgment Day. That nightmarish element is present in the film. The setting is dark and desolate, which adds a disquieting atmosphere to the chase scenes, and even the more grounded moments when Sarah and Reese are in the tunnel together. The folks at Orion Pictures had actually asked Cameron to shoot more scenes in daylight due to budget constraints, but Cameron refused, believing that it was stylistically and thematically crucial to keep most of the film set at night. In addition to the dark LA streets, things always feel eerily out of sync. There's the literal sense, where Sarah and Reese are literally out of sync with time due to Reese's time travel, but there's an aesthetic side to this feeling too. The way that the Terminator moves, slowly and disjointedly, has a dreamy touch to it. Cameron described his thought process for these movements during the making of the Terminator retrospective in 1992, where he stated, "What I found effective on Terminator was to do a slow motion build-up, or to subtly segue into slow motion where you almost don't realize it, and it becomes a dreamlike pace or that dilation of time when you experience a traffic accident and it's happening and you can't stop it and time seems to stretch. This effect makes the viewer feel the same disorientation and terror that Sarah is experiencing."
I said to Jim, I really think that we can create the Endo full size and get a lot of performance out of the real thing, doing it with puppetry and animatronics.
The effects, performances, and ahead of its time AI themes all make the Terminator horrifying, but I can't forget to mention that pulsing synth soundtrack. Composer Brad Fiedel's score gives the film an ominous and disorientating undercurrent. The main theme has this unhinged thumping that's like a heartbeat. Brad explained that what he was trying to get across with the score was this idea of this mechanical man and his heartbeat. Notably, the time signature is in 1310, which isn't a beat that pops up very often. It turns out, this bizarre notation was largely caused by accident. Due to budget constraints, Fidel was using various synths and sequences that he had to sync by hand. As a result, he ended up with this slightly off-sounding rhythm that had a distinctly unsettling feel to it.
Most of all of the endoskeleton work being done in stop-motion animation.
He wanted it to look as real as he could. He always struggled with how he was going to get what he wanted.
The various stop-motion effects used in the film by Fantasy 2 hold up incredibly well to this day. A 2-foot-tall puppet was created for the stop-motion sequences by model maker Doug Beswick. It was important to Cameron that the audience believed that this robot exoskeleton was actually Schwarzenegger, so he directed the actor to limp away in the scene before the exoskeleton is revealed. His limp matched the gait of the animated models perfectly, and this sold the experience. But it's Stan Winston's innovative use of puppetry, stop motion, and special effects makeup which are to thank for the film's fantastic visuals. Initially, Cameron assumed that most of the film's action would be comprised of stop-motion shots, but Winston showed him that the desirable effects could be achieved using full-size puppets instead. His studio created a full-sized and wearable T-800 puppet that puppeteer Shane Mahan wore strapped to his back. Meanwhile, other operators would control the signature glowing red eyes via remote control.
There's no way when you're making your first film that you have any objectivity at all about what you've captured.
You never really know how a movie's going to do until it gets in front of an audience.
Interestingly enough, this iconic and unnerving film was really difficult to get off the ground. All these behind-the-scenes tidbits make it obvious that Cameron had a clear vision and a keen eye for detail that makes the horror of the Terminator sell. But at the time, Cameron only had one film credit to his name, Piranha 2, a film that he tried to distance himself from, and his own agent didn't believe that he could ever get the project off the ground. Desperate, Cameron ended up selling the rights to the Terminator to producer Gale Anne Hurd for only $1 years before their marriage. Even the Terminator himself wasn't totally sold on the film. Though Schwarzenegger did eventually fall in love with the iconic villain while reading the script, he and Orion Pictures didn't really believe that the film would be that big of a deal. They essentially viewed it as little more than a B-movie, and the actor admitted as much in a recent interview with GQ.
I think they treated it like as a B-movie. But Jim Cameron showed me some of the footage. I said to myself, this is really intense.
It wasn't until he saw the first cut of the film that he realized he was part of something big. While Stan Winston and his team brought it to life, the design of the T-800 was actually created by Cameron. Winston and Cameron went back and forth on designs, and the director encouraged the team to make modifications as they saw fit, but ultimately, Winston and company stuck with the first design that Cameron came up with. From there, Winston and 7 other artists worked together to make a Terminator puppet out of clay, and then cemented it in plaster that was reinforced with steel. To create the outside of the exoskeleton, Shane Mahan recounts that they would create pieces out of plastic and then run them through an electrostatic process to apply a metallic finish. However, he and the team quickly discovered that this method resulted in a lot of chip paint during the action scenes, forcing them to patch up various pieces of the puppet with foil and paint. By the time that T2 came around, they had developed a more durable chroming process.
And I read the script and I immediately could relate much more to the character of Terminator than the heroic character.
Initially, this was not a Jim idea, and frankly, he wasn't happy about it.
It's hard to imagine anyone else as a Terminator, but believe it or not, Arnie was not the first pick. Orion Pictures had actually suggested O.J. Simpson as the lead, but Cameron turned it down because he didn't think that he made a believable killer. Kind of ironic, because, you know.
That did that shit.
Cameron had worked with Lance Henriksen previously and was actually set on having him play the Terminator. Initially, he envisioned the villain as someone who would blend in with the crowd, hiding in his synthetic flesh camouflage. However, once Arnie had signed on for the role, it became apparent that the T-800 was not going to be attacking in secret or hiding. This 6-foot bodybuilder was not gonna blend in, so the character turned into this indestructible beast, which is ultimately more terrifying. Of course, Henriksen would then go on to play the role of Detective Vukovic.
What about when he punched through the windshield?
He was probably on PCP. Broke every bone in his hand and wouldn't feel it for hours.
Linda Hamilton is amazing as Sarah Connor, and as the audience surrogate, is arguably the linchpin that sells the believability of the film. Hamilton was cast shortly after filming Children of the Corn, beating out actresses Gina Davis and Patricia Arquette. Her portrayal of Sarah Connor in the film is truly impressive once you realize the full scope of the character she plays. Though the 19-year-old we see running around Los Angeles isn't a fully fledged badass resistance leader just yet, she's not your average damsel in distress either. Connor is written into the script as having a vulnerable quality that masks a strength that she doesn't know exists. Hamilton essentially had to play this unassuming young waitress, but still be strong enough so that it was believable that she would later become the gun-wielding heroine we would see in later films. Seeing her grow over the course of the franchise is incredibly rewarding, and this film perfectly sets up the character's development.
Arnold read the script and said, well, I want to play this Terminator guy. And so Jim went from just about ready to pick a fight with him to, that's a good idea.
Interestingly, Schwarzenegger was initially auditioning for the role of Kyle Reese, who would actually end up being played by Michael Biehn. They met together for lunch, and Arnie kept talking about how he thought the Terminator should act. He wrote in his 2013 memoir, Total Recall, that he became fixated on the villain while reading the script. He stated to Cameron that there should be no joy, no gratification, and no victory lap. The Terminator's purpose is to complete the mission and nothing else. And the director immediately turned to him and said, well, since you've analyzed it better than the way that I've written it, why don't you play the Terminator? The rest is history. At first, Arnie wasn't too keen. After all, the Terminator only has 17 lines and a total of 65 words spoken. Still, the villain has a powerful presence, and Schwarzenegger's performance would define the tone and become the backbone of the series of films to come. The Terminator was cold, violent, ruthless, and had no emotional range or connection to its words or actions, and almost never showed a facial expression beyond its cold, flat face, speaking only when it meant to engage others for information or as a form of distraction. Nearly 4 decades later, The Terminator is still definitively one of the most amazing sci-fi horror films of all time.
This is wild. I mean, I don't think we've ever seen anything like this before. The way it was shot, the way it was lit, the way it was directed, everything. It was just really very, very special.
Well, that's all for today, folks. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to stay up to date on all my content. And yeah, if you have any other suggestions, feel free to leave them in the comments below. As always, it's been a pleasure. Nihat here with Film Comics Explained. Thanks for stopping by.
And you won't tell me what's going on? I am worried sick here.
Okay. Okay, here's the number.
I love you, Mom.
I love you too, sweetheart.